and make sure all the school teaching the children how to be a homosexual and make sure they all teach about the transgender. So that is what important to me.
So we have some interesting developments coming from Iran's allies, and I have to say, as much as a lot of people around the world are not going to like to hear this, it doesn't look like the American empire is actually going anywhere, because we have properly identified this conflict from day one as being a proxy war in some form against larger powers, which is why about on a weekly basis, I've tried to do a discussion about not just China, but really the whole Eastern axis, the BRICS aligned countries, whatever you want to call it. But we understand what we're talking about, right? That sort of anti-American bloc of nations that includes people like China, Russia, Iran, formerly Venezuela, Belarus, North Korea, right? Countries like this, and keeping an eye on what they're doing. Because I'll be honest, one of my big fears for many years when it came to if America tried to get into a conflict with Iran was the possibility that I sort of had the perception, and I have to admit, in retrospect, I was completely wrong about this, that alliance actually existed, right? That it was actually a real thing. That potentially, if America did something with Iran, you could see China and Russia directly get involved and you'd have a very messy World War III style situation, except you notice that's not even remotely what has happened. As a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite. Despite the fact that China has issued some type of vague statement of condemnation, Russia allegedly is giving Iran some troop locations, but you can tell they haven't really done a whole lot with it, that actually these countries have completely diplomatically and militarily abandoned Iran, which really does go to show, again, how fake, how paper tigery this alliance actually is. Because I think what you realize at the end of the day is that while all these countries might practically unify based on the sentiment that they're trying to oppose America, they don't really share a lot in common. And secondly, you notice a lot of these people are ruthlessly pragmatic, selfish autocracies. So if push comes to shove, China, Russia, these countries are not going to come to bail out Venezuela. They're not going to come to bail out Iran. And by the way, I do think that smaller countries are watching that and observing and realizing, oh, maybe we shouldn't align with these people, because if America gets pissed at us for doing so, notice how our so-called big bad allies won't actually come to bail us out. And folks, as it pertains to North Korea today, a country we haven't really spoken about much thus far, I've mentioned them a couple times, but never really dedicated that extensive coverage to, I believe that is exactly what we're watching, because it's some pretty interesting developments, despite the fact that North Korea, labels America as their big bad enemy, Rocket Man. We know all about their behavior. We're well familiar with it for decades at this point, right? Actually, very quietly, you may have noticed, has not even really said anything when it came to defending Iran. Actually, as a matter of fact, right now, it's being rumored that North Korea is deliberately trying to distance itself from Iran to hopefully open up diplomatic attempts once again with the United States of America. In other words, Kim Jong Un wants to come back to the table and maybe try again with President Trump. And on the surface, that may seem like just a rebellion against Iran, but I'd further point out it's not. It's also really what this is about, I would argue, is North Korea giving the big middle finger to China, because a story that hasn't been covered a lot in Western media as a whole in recent years is actually the fact that negotiations and relations between Beijing and Pyongyang have completely disintegrated. And notice how, right, a lot of countries, I would argue, that are aligned with China right now are realizing how useless of an ally China actually is, how, the military technology they sell you is going to be completely useless. They're not going to come to your defense. They're not going to do anything to bail you out or whatever. And frankly, some of these countries are likely saying, why should we keep on basically being a vassal state for Beijing? So I would argue you're sort of watching that behavior right now from North Korea. And we'll talk about this announcement here today as to how, as you can see, North Korea is deliberately distancing itself from Iran during the war to keep open the possibility of improved ties with the U.S. according to South Korea. And that, by the way, aligns directly with what Kim Jong Un said at the Party Congress at the start of this conflict. He, when Maduro Maduro was toppled. He got really mad and he threatened America. Notably with Iran, he didn't do that. He actually kind of expressed almost openness to diplomacy or peace or something. And it was very noteworthy coming from obviously this kind of ridiculous, cartoonish, autocratic government, right? So I'll tell you all about it, guys. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. That's the best way to support our work, and it also ensures that you can stay up to date with all of the latest news and coverage. And that said, some pretty interesting details here, right? First and foremost, we do know at this point, North Korea has given no military aid to Iran. Now, you could say maybe they didn't do the same for Venezuela. They've given plenty of military aid, by the way, to Russia when it comes to Ukraine, and we'll talk about that relationship in a second, but no aid to Iran. But furthermore, no condolences after Ayatollah Khamenei's death, right? That's something you would think North Korea of all countries would make a big statement about, right? Look at what America did. The evil capitalist imperialists, they're killing leaders. We stand with, they actually didn't say that, right? Now, you probably just didn't think about North Korea at the time, but now that you're considering that, that's totally something you would think North Korea should comment on, right? They didn't do that. Furthermore, no message recognizing his successor in Khamenei's son. Public statements, as you may have heard, are limited and toned down, avoiding criticism of Donald Trump. Very interesting. And then Kim Jong Un recently said at a party congress, quote, "No reason we cannot get along with the United States." South Korean intel says preparation to secure new diplomatic space with the United States. And what's interesting about this is it's actually a shock to most North Korea analysts because, you know, obviously you had the talks with Trump back in 2018, 2019. You may also remember, by the way, that despite maybe a new warmness, a new opening to talk, it actually broke down, right? People seem to forget that. So it broke down between America and North Korea over sanctions relief and stuff like that. And then under Biden, if people don't know this, actually North Korea basically revised its constitution to say that they no longer supported peaceful reunification with the South. They blew up like the memorial that's supposed to be a monument to reunification and declared South Korea as the top enemy, right? And keep in mind, you're talking here about, as an Asian, I'll say this, right? Asian regimes, when they say this type of stuff, when they basically say you're disowned from the family, which they said to South Korea, that's something pretty intense. And so, you know, you've probably noticed for a long time, North Korea has been relatively quiet because they have this new militaristic stance. We are not open to talking anymore. No more negotiation. South Korea is the enemy, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, as of recent months, that tone has completely done a 180, right? Suddenly now they want to talk again with this new second Trump administration. What are the reasons for that? Well, you could argue that maybe North Korea is scared they'll be next, but I'll say in total fairness, North Korea does actually have nuclear weapons. And so I think both sides understand that's not a realistic possibility. I think there's a lot more to it than that. And that, again, has a lot to do with politics and the fact that North Korea has basically spent the last several years trying to humiliate China and Beijing because Beijing abandoned them. And you may say, what are you talking about, Vince? We'll talk about that later in a second. But first, take a listen here to the details in terms of apparently the way North Korea is now talking, according to Reuters. And I'll give you my live thoughts as we go.
North Korea appears to be quietly pulling back from longtime partner Iran, while keeping its options open with the United States. That's according to South Korean lawmakers on Monday, after they were briefed by the country's intelligence agency. Seoul's National Intelligence Service, or NIS, said Pyongyang hasn't sent weapons or supplies to Iran since the war began in late February, and has stayed notably silent after Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed in airstrikes.
Very interesting too, by the way. So they did give some support to Iran before, but when it all started, North Korea just pulled back, right? And again, do you notice how selfish these countries are? Why maybe we shouldn't fear that part of the world unifying against America because they're not unified and they never will be, right? You can actually play the strategy of divide and conquer. It should be U.S. policy to really just try to isolate these countries from each other as much as possible, right? Keep North Korea isolated from China, isolated from Russia if we can. Keep China and Russia isolated from one another. You try to reverse engineer the Sino-Soviet split, which, by the way, during the Cold War was an extremely effective strategy by Nixon. You know, something to consider there. But you are noticing this, right? These countries are not unified, and it's very interesting to watch. You may look right now at America and Europe and say, oh, NATO's disintegrating. That's highly concerning. Maybe on some level it is. But even then, right, even all of the blustering aside, I would argue America and Europe are still more unified than these people, which is just really interesting, again, to watch.
North Korea also did not congratulate Khamenei's son after he was named Iran's new leader. While China and Russia have spoken out repeatedly on the conflict, Pyongyang has issued just 2 toned-down statements so far and has avoided direct criticism of U.S. President Donald Trump. The NIS believes that restraint is deliberate, aimed at preserving diplomatic space ahead of the summit between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Trump in May. At the same time, South Korean intelligence says the war is adding to pressure on North Korea's economy, forcing Pyongyang to look beyond Iran for support. Park Sun-won is a member of the South Korean Parliament's Intelligence Committee.
North Korea is also facing significant economic difficulties due to the war in the Middle East. They are experiencing setbacks in securing industrial supplies, rising prices, and soaring exchange rates. Amid these circumstances, they are making moves to secure additional oil from Russia.
Intelligence officials say Kim Jong Un's recent comments about getting along with the U.S. point to a calculated move, positioning North Korea for talks with Washington once the Middle East conflict calms down.
Yeah, well, it's certainly interesting to watch, and I think you have to ask the question truly, what is Kim Jong Un's angle here, right? By the way, this is coinciding with apparently he gave some recent compliments to the South Korean president today, which, again, about a year or two ago, they blew South Korea out of their constitution. They said no reunification for the first time in North Korea's enemy. Didn't just call South Korea the puppet state, but the actual enemy, like it's our right to annihilate South Korea. And then now all of a sudden they're saying, oh, thank you, South Korea, for the diplomatic gesture. We're so happy about it, right? What's really going on? Well, first and foremost, I will note it certainly does help that we have an actual president here and not, in the words of Kim Jong Un himself, I'm not making this up, apparently, a mentally retarded person, according to Trump. So, that's a benefit for sure, but there's more to it than that, obviously.
To protect them from North Korea, we have 45,000 soldiers in South Korea to protect us from Kim Jong Un, who I get along with very well, as you know. Do you notice he said very nice things about me? He used to call Joe Biden a mentally retarded person, okay? So don't tell me about your stuff. Joe Biden, he said he's a mentally retarded person. He was so nasty to Joe Biden. It was terrible. But to me, he likes Trump. And do you notice how nice things are with North Korea? It's very nice.
Yeah, so what's going on here and what's North Korea's angle? Well, certainly a change of American leadership helps, although I would argue it's a little bit deeper than that. What's actually happening right now is North Korea is effectively giving the middle finger to China. And you might sit there and think to yourself, well, I thought China and North Korea were best friends. They share a border. They were part of the communist world during the Cold War. They're part of the, again, whatever name you want to give it, but the anti-American bloc in the post-Cold War era. Isn't it that simple? Shouldn't they be the best of friends? The answer is actually no. If you know anything about this relationship, it's a lot more complicated than it may seem on the surface. And that, by the way, goes back a long way. Even to the Korean War itself, not a lot of people know this, but actually China, Mao Zedong at the time, did not want Kim Il-sung to start the war and invade the South because Mao wanted to go and invade Taiwan in sometime in the 1950s, right? He was going to finish the job basically from the Chinese Civil War, and having to get involved to bail out Kim Il-sung in Korea actually interfered in that ability. So there were a lot of times during even the Cold War, even back then when everyone was unified under the communist bloc, that North Korea and China had strained relations. Actually, as a matter of fact, there are many different decades where North Korea basically went to Russia as their main benefactor instead of choosing China. So this actually goes back a long way, but the modern breakdown of the China-North Korea relationship actually started under Deng Xiaoping, right? When China basically opened up to the world, ditched the hardcore communism thing, started liberalizing their economy. Few people know this, but actually for several decades, the CCP has been pressuring North Korea to follow China's model, right? Become a more quote unquote normal country, stop all this crazy juche stuff, all the communism stuff, open up, be normal, liberalize, stop this like crazy cult hereditary dynasty thing you have going on. As a matter of fact, China has been calling for that, right? China under Deng Xiaoping actually cut foreign aid from North Korea, and North Korea got really pissed about that. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and so North Korea obviously has a big famine back in the 1990s, but you had that for a long time. And basically, ever since China cut that aid under the Deng Xiaoping administration, North Korea has basically been playing these petty games where they want to get back at China or humiliate China. So there's been a big back and forth. But few people also know this. Back during the 2010s, China actually tried to get North Korea to denuclearize, which might seem a little surprising now in retrospect, given, strained U.S. and China relations. But I repeat, right, China has tried to actually get North Korea to drop this whole Kim Jong Un juche thing for a long time. And North Korea has effectively just stood up and refused. And so what you have watched on both sides is that basically both countries have disrespected each other. They've humiliated each other. And if you know anything about Asian culture, right, the whole honor thing is very important, the saving face and all that. So really, as I said, trade, this is a complicated situation. Trade, for example, has completely collapsed between China and North Korea. China has basically stopped sending them almost any aid at all. It's very minimal at this point. And so really post-COVID, North Korea was starving up until the moment where Putin invaded Ukraine. North Korea saw an angle, and so now Russia and North Korea, much like the Cold War, are sort of buddy-buddy again, whereas China's left out, and China doesn't really want anything to do with North Korea. So, there's a lot of complicated stuff here going on, but the overall point here is what? I repeat, these countries that you think are unified against America actually are not. And maybe it shouldn't be surprising because they're all cold of personality kind of dictatorships, and what happens in that, right? A lot of backstabbing, a lot of mafia-style games. That's really what's happening here behind the scenes. By the way, for those of you guys who maybe are more curious about this issue, I encourage you to go check out this YouTube channel right here, Untold by Tony. He has a great video on this that provided some of my information. I'll play a small part of it just so you can understand, right, sort of what's going on here. But I encourage you, right, go check him out, Untold by Tony. Great channel uncovering North Korea if you're more interested in this country and its politics. But take a listen.
So in February 2013, just 1 month before Xi Jinping officially became the chairman, Kim sent Xi a welcome gift. After 4 years of silence, North Korea conducted its third nuclear test, the first one under Kim Jong Un's rule. It was basically a huge slap across Xi's face. A few months later, in April, Xi attended the Boao Forum, his first major international event after taking office. During his speech, he said, "No one should pursue their own self-interest at the cost of regional stability." Coming from the leader of China, that line was basically a diplomatic middle finger to Kim Jong Un. Since then, China has voted for every UN resolution sanctioning North Korea's nuclear tests. Because of those sanctions and Xi Jinping's personal fallout with Kim Jong-un, relations between China and North Korea have completely frozen over. In recent years, trade between the two countries has dropped from over $5 billion a year to just a little over $2 billion. And that's mostly just limited to food and basic goods. Weapons, tech, and high-end machinery, forget it. China won't even talk about it. So what's life like inside North Korea now? According to a former North Korean diplomat who defected, family of North Korean embassy staff now beg their relatives aboard to bring back anything, literally anything when they return home. Even used toothbrush, because the country is completely empty. Everything was in extreme shortages. Now you would think that with things this bad, Kim Jong-un would be desperate to build ties with China, to get more aids, more trade, and more help. But no, he is still out here playing his little games just to mess with Beijing. But why that is the case? Well, the answer is very simple. When North Korea was at its lowest point, our old friend Vladimir Putin came to rescue.
So yeah, while you would think on the surface from 40,000 feet that these countries are all unified, in reality, what's been happening the past couple of years is that North Korea is once again starving because Beijing effectively cut them off. And so as a result, Kim Jong Un has been using Russia as a means to effectively troll and try to play games with Beijing. And it's just this weird love triangle of nonsense and scheming and, conniving that it's just a big, gigantic mess. But the overall point here, once again, is what I think you can clearly see the evidence. These countries are not actually that well unified and don't really get along with each other. And I've brought up this fear before, right? That, well, the moment that China goes and moves on Taiwan, if they end up doing that, I think it's pretty clear based on what you've seen from the US military, we probably could handle China. It wouldn't be easy, but we could handle China in a conventional perspective. However, right, what happens if it's not just China invading Taiwan? What happens if it's World War III? Let's say Iran, if they were still around, did something in the Middle East. Let's say formerly Venezuela starts causing war in Latin America. North Korea, the big one, right, moves on South Korea. That would distract US power all around the world. And that could be the way, right, that side of the world ultimately ends up potentially winning the conflict. However, here's the thing, okay? I speculated maybe North Korea would seize that opportunity to try to move on South Korea if China did that in Taiwan. However, right, if relations between North Korea and China are this strained, and you can see China effectively abandon North Korea and vice versa, I think you see very clear evidence that's not going to happen. And by the way, as it pertains even potentially to Beijing's other allies like Iran, it's worth noting they don't sound all too happy, by the way, with the way they've been treated by the CCP, both before and even during this conflict. For example, take a listen.
China's investment is not coming. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian makes a shock statement admitting Beijing hasn't delivered and says anyone who wants it should go get it themselves.
Yeah, so I would argue what all these countries are actually learning right now is that China is not that reliable of an ally, right? Iran has watched as they've effectively just left them out to dry, how the Chinese missiles and missile defense systems were completely useless in both Iran and Venezuela. They're probably asking for a refund behind the scenes right now. If we were to be honest, North Korea has understood this for several decades. That's exactly why right now I would argue they're trying to seek revenge, not just by establishing close ties with Russia, but even now offering to go even have negotiations with America because they just want to get revenge on Beijing and effectively say, F you, we don't need you, we're going to keep rubbing this in your face, right? So it's a pretty interesting development to watch, but I would also point out, hey, to countries like Canada, to the EU countries who have been as of late claiming America's not trustworthy, right? They're too unpredictable. We want a stable, more reliable trading partner, so we're going to go to China, which is exactly what they're doing right now. Maybe you ought to take notes of that, right? How is China actually treating its allies around the world? Well, it turns out not very well. Why? Because Xi Jinping, for better or for worse, is ultimately a very self-interested leader, okay? He only cares about China. He's not really here to come bail out anybody else. Push comes to shove, he's going to take care of his own country first. And maybe there's a part of that that's admirable. There's also a part of it, though, however, that's also like, well, you're basically trying to build a global empire here in China that rivals America. And yet the countries that are unified with you, you just keep on making this public statement, China don't care about you, right? It's not actually a good thing, I would argue, for them. But that said, again, all of this stuff about BRICS, about these countries, about China and North Korea moving in Asian conflict together, I think you're seeing the signs, right? They're just not going to happen. It's just not realistic, actually. Because ultimately, all of these leaders have too big of egos and they're too narcissistic and they're too self-interested to really work together all that well. And that ought to give you some reassurance, right? If you're an American who's kind of worried about these countries scheming against us. Frankly, I think we have a lot to worry about because they're too busy scheming against each other. And I repeat, it's in America's best interest to just do our best to isolate all of these powers from each other, right? North Korea wants to talk. I say, let's talk. right? So let's make sure, let's try to pull North Korea away from those countries. Same goes for Russia if they want to talk about Ukraine. Same, by the way, goes with China if they want to talk about trade, right? We have a little bit of leverage with each different country in different ways. So why not just say, okay, you know, maybe on some issues we'll try to pull China away from Russia. Maybe others will pull Russia away from China. Just do the chess, right? Kind of just play both sides of it. But really, you can see how easy it actually is to play both sides of these countries because they're literally always scheming against each other. So just figure out a way, if you're Trump, to use that to the benefit of America, I think is very interesting theme here to talk about. But anyways, that said, let me know your thoughts on this, guys, in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and until next time, God bless and peace.